Bienvenidos. Welcome to the Instituto Cervantes. I'm Victor Ugarte, the director. He says His Excellency Apostolic Nuncio of the Court of St. James. Welcome to your first visit to our place. Minister Councillor Robles, diplomats, authorities, and friends of the Instituto. I'm here just to say a very short welcome and to thank today's speakers and collaborators. Claudia Hawkins, Sir Barry Ive, Tom Cheshire, and very special thanks for his participation and wise advice and collaboration for the Traveller series starting today, to Mr. Manuel Butler, Consular for Tourism at the Spanish Embassy in London. This series of lectures will last for 2 years and will be introduced later by you briefly by his curator, Alberto Egea Fernández Montesinos. Thank you very much, Alberto. He came from Sevilla today to explain about this series. Thanks also our head of library, Maite. I don't know where are you because everything is her idea. So please join the library if you are not members because this is about the library. We want to showcase our books, our collection, which is amazing, and we're going to discover this very, very soon in this lecture. We also have a great surprise. We have here some descendants of the traveler to Spain, Richard Ford, the author of the Handbook for Travelers to Spain. So welcome. Today, the ambassador of Spain was going to address you for this inauguration of the lecture series, but on a last-minute event, he could not attend, and he appointed Minister Councillor José María Robles Fraga, an ambassador himself, to speak on his behalf. So, Ambassador.
Thank you, Victor. So you don't get the ambassador, you get me. So I well, it's a pleasure to be here, of course, the Instituto Cervantes with such a distinguished speakers. And I understand that Victor has done and his team a great job putting together this program, 2-year-long traveler cycle, which examines the vision of Spain presented to British travelers. And then I would make a stop because they were really travelers. They were not tourists. Sorry, Manolo. Now you only get 20 million tourists coming to Spain. But these men and women were really traveling, probably taking the long tradition of traveling as not just a physical exercise, but also a spiritual coming of age, un viaje, as we say in Spanish, and not just a visit. And they left their imprint, and they got when they came back to England, they were probably different people. They had a very strong connection. They felt a very strong connection with what they had witnessed or they had experienced. And that's the point of this cycle, to see how Spain's image and reality has evolved into this 21st century form, and how also the relationship between our two countries has evolved. Travelers to Spain coming from the UK were privileged people because it was not easy. Not just because there was terrible roads or pirates or brigands, but because our relations were not very good, all the time. Even though we had also moments of great friendship and closeness. I just came enjoying the London traffic here, and I saw Charing Cross, which is one of the Eleanor crosses built by Edward, I think the first remembering his wife, Eleanor of Castile. They only were married for 36 years, which is a pretty good record for the time. And so we have our moments, and probably in some of them, when the relations allow it, these travelers could come to Spain And that's why we didn't have the grand tour. We had a very, very privileged tour, very privileged people who came to Spain and then wrote their impressions and published them, which was the thing to do in those times. London was a great printing capital, and they could transmit that experience to the British public. And now we have, thanks to the collection that I must say that Victor Ugarte has is in office. He's the great guardian of this collection. We can now see in this cycle how these impressions were presented to the British public. These speakers include, of course, professors Claudia Hopkins, my very good friend, and Professor Sir Barry Ive, who's always fighting the Habsburg Empire and trying to get to difficult archives here and there to collect and research. Lately, I think it's on Scarlatti, isn't it? And of course, writer and journalist Tom Cheshire and others. We look forward to events to come. We're going to have a splendid seminar celebrating very unique visit by our Spanish Navy, four-masted sailing vessel, the Juan Sebastián Elcano, who has traveled over 2 million nautical miles and is also a witness of great travels and experiences by our Navy men and women. So I hope you the best seminar, the best cycle, and I convey to you the salutations of my ambassador, who unfortunately was not able to do it. So I have the privilege to say thanks to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Now I leave the floor to the curator, Alberto Gea, who is going to briefly explain this series of talks. Alberto.
Good afternoon. First of all, I wanted to thank Victor Ugarte for having asked me to curate this series. It all started 10 years ago when Queen Sofia of Spain inaugurated an exhibition on the image of Spain, and all the writers and all the artists that have visited our country in the last 2 centuries. And it was ever since that I started also researching on the image of Spain and how it has been presented. I think like 6 months ago, the director of Instituto Cervantes asked me to do this series, and I started to think which area would be good to present to the British public, and I couldn't choose but one topic, so we ended up with 8 topics that will be presented throughout these 2 years of series. We're going to start this series entitled Travelers to Spain, a Cultural Tour from 19th Century Views to Social Media Today, exactly presenting the views of artists and explorers that visited our country and has made it into a tourist destination very popular destination for the British tourists. We will have in July another series that is entitled Juan Sebastián Elcano Training Ship, Spanish Navigation and Sustainability. That will be coming up in the month of July. We will also have another one in September that will be entitled Putting the Spotlight on Women, Female Travelers and Gender. So we'll be addressing the importance of women travelers that in some occasions had not been underlined enough, and their importance. We'll continue with another one, which will be rediscovering Spanish gastronomy from stereotypes of the past to globally renowned cuisine. That will be in November of this year. And then in the following year, we are still working on those series, but we'll have certainly, key figures and authors in the areas of traveling. We'll have Michael Portillo, a traveler across Spain, and that would be also part of the Oxford Literary Festival in February of next year. We'll also come back to the 21st century, and then we'll see the evolution of the initial Richard Ford impressions and how today our young TikTokers and Instagrammers present Spain to a global audience. That will be in spring of 2025. And that's about it. Thanks again to Instituto Cervantes for this wonderful opportunity. And then it will be Manuel Butler that will follow with the introduction of the series today. I hope you enjoy then this series.
Buenas tardes, good evening. First of all, I would like to congratulate Victor Ugarte, the director of the Spanish Institute Cervantes here in London, for organizing this conference, analyzing the image of Spain through the British travelers is more than needed. Let me explain briefly a couple of ideas. The image of a country is vital. It's the perception based on real facts. The image of a country changes very slowly. It's very difficult to change it. It's in a nutshell the reputation of a country in the international arena. Reputation has to do with trust and credibility, and is highly relevant for the economy and politics, and most importantly, for the understanding of people of different nations and origins. Changing the image is a very hard task, it's a challenge, and we are changing now from the Spanish Tourist Office the image of Spain as a destination here in the UK, and we are involved in this hard task, linking Spain with the sustainability. Let me add that the image of nation is analyzed for years. One of the best accepted index is the Annual Nation Brand Index, which considers 6 parameters: exports, Spanish people, in our case, governance, culture, investment, and tourism. Remember that Spain receives every year 17 million tourists yearly on average. That's tremendous. That's over 20% of the total amount of tourists that we receive yearly, and we are a champion worldwide in terms of tourism. And the impact on the image of Spain in the UK is outstanding. In this first session, we will explore the significant changes in the representation of Spain from the 19th century to the present day. That's why we are very lucky today that we have 3 distinguished scholars and writers to answer questions on the evolution of the cultural and tourist image of Spain, depicted in classical engravings and paintings and contemporary selfies and TikToks. Let me introduce Sir Barry Ive. Is a cultural historian specializing in literature, art and music of early modern Spain, and has recently developed a serious interest in literary and visual representation of Spain of the 19th century travelers. He held the Cervantes Chair of Spanish at the King's College in London, and he was the principal of the Guildhall School of Music and Drama, where he's now a research professor. He's currently working on a book on the voice of Cervantes, and is directing the Leverhulme Trust Textim Scarlatti project. He was enacted New Year honors for services to performing arts education, and he was appointed Knight Commander of the Order of Isabel la Católica. The floor is yours, Sir Barry.
Thank you very much, and good evening, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here and to be sharing the platform with Claudia Hopkins and Tom Cheshire. As many of you will know, Claudia and I co-curated an exhibition of illustrated printed books called, can I have my title slide up, please?
Yeah, right.
Okay, right. We co-curated an exhibition of illustrated printed books called Impressions of Spain in the 1830s, held at the Morn Library in King's College, London, last autumn. And the center of gravity of that exhibition was the year 1833, the year in which the 6 artist travelers that we featured were all in Spain at the same time: Richard and Harriet Ford, John Frederick Lewis, George Vivian, Owen Jones, and David Roberts. And 1833 was the year David Roberts first met his Spanish mentee, Genaro Pérez Villamil, a relationship that was celebrated in the exhibition Romantic Spain that Claudia curated at the Real Academia de Bellas Artes in Madrid in 2021. So we included him as well. The early 1830s were a kind of sweet spot between 2 periods of exceptional turbulence in Spanish history: the Peninsular War on the one hand and the Carlist Wars on the other. The restoration of Ferdinand VII, the liberal triennium, and the period of authoritarian rule that followed meant that Spain was rarely out of the headlines. Many of the liberal exiles were prominently visible in English public life, and Spain increasingly became an object of interest, reasonably safe, relatively easy to get to by land and sea, and offering the prospect of an Oriental experience without the need to go to the Middle East. The death of Ferdinand VII in 1833, the consequent succession crisis, and the Carlist Wars that followed would put paid to that short-lived period of relative stability. And in artistic and cultural terms, 1833 was also a pivot point, 5 years after the death of Goya and 6 years before the advent of photography. The 6 artist travelers and 1 homegrown artist who coincided in Spain in 1833 documented their impressions in a large number of high-quality illustrations, many of which were published in the years that follow. Lewis was first off the mark with 52 lithographs in 2 volumes in 1835 and 1836. Roberts was close behind with an album of 26 lithographs in 1837, and he supplied the drawings for almost all the 84 engravings in the 4 volumes of guides published by Thomas Roscoe between 1835 and 1838. A couple of volumes of that are in the exhibition upstairs. George Vivian was next with 61 lithographs in 2 volumes in 1838 and 1839. Jones's 2 volumes took longer while he developed his own chromolithographic technique. And finally, in this group, Villamil's 3 volumes published in Paris contained 135 lithographs, only a handful of which are set in Andalusia, and none is set in Granada or the Alhambra. This is a Spanish artist making a strong statement about the importance of architecture and landscape of northern and central Spain. It's a masterpiece and deserves to be better known. There aren't very many copies in the UK, and I doubt very much that they're much consulted, perhaps because of their size and weight. My copy weighs 18 kilos. The conspicuous absentee from this list is, of course, Richard Ford. His celebrated handbook of 1845 had no illustrations, even though he made hundreds of sketches during his extensive travels around Spain between 1831 and 1833. With the exception of a small number that David Roberts reworked for the Roscoe volumes, nothing of Ford's work saw the light of day until his great-grandson, Brinsley, published 3 pieces in the Burlington magazine in 1942. Larger selections were published in Granada in 1955 and Seville in 1963. Brinsley himself curated a major exhibition at the Wildenstein Gallery in 1974, and there was an even larger exhibition, Richard Ford, Viajes por España, in Madrid in 2014. Happily, the surviving sketches and the many watercolors that Richard made from them after he returned to England are in the care of the Ford family, and we were immensely grateful to Francis and Kate Ford for their loan of several items for our exhibition last autumn, and I'm equally grateful for permission to photograph a few more for this talk. For many visitors to our exhibition, however, the star of the show wasn't one of Richard's drawings, but this one by his wife, Harriet. Let's take it virtually out of its frame and have a closer look. It's a drawing of the upper level of the Patio del Meshwar in the Alhambra, where the Fords lived in the summer of 1831. It's unsigned, but according to the Wildenstein catalogue, Richard Ford has written on the back, Facade al lienzo en el Patio de la Mezquita in the Alhambra, taken from the passage leading to the kitchen in the Alcaides quarters, in which we spent the summer of 1831, drawn by Harriet Ford. The window with the flower pot opened into my dressing room. Richard's inscription is retrospective, not just in tense, it's written in the past tense, obviously, but also in point of view. And for me, the clear implication is that the drawing was made in 1831, rather than 2 years later during the Fords' second visit, when they stayed in a different part of the Alhambra. This detail will be important when we come to consider the question of Harriet's originality as an artist. I think this image is remarkable, both for its precision and its sense of atmosphere. It contrives to be both hyper-realistic and impressionistic at the same time. This is partly due perhaps to the mixed media, pencil and wash, but partly to the differential treatment of some of the architectural features. The almost photographic treatment of the roof detail, for example, as against the much sketchier change. Right, no, it's gone too far. Right, sorry about this, it's very slow. No. We don't want to be there, thank you.
Right, ready. Yep.
Okay. As against, right, I was just saying the featuring the detail of the roof detail, the photographic treatment of the roof detail, and compared with the much sketchier treatment of the facade, which you see here. This gives the piece a slightly provisional, unfinished feel, as if the viewer is invited to fill in more of the detail as they wish. Other features of the composition also help to draw the viewer into the scene. The balustrade here places the viewer and the artist in the same shared space in the gallery. And the open door on the left invites the viewer's curiosity, reinforced by the glimpse of the window beyond. And please keep that window in mind, as I'll be inviting you to look through it later in this talk. The open door, windows, shutters, and darkened interior all contrive to suggest a cool draft that contrasts with the sun-baked, south-facing exterior. The picture does more than simply show us what things look like. It tells us what it felt to be there, and it invites us to share that complex mixture of heat and coolness, light and dark, outside and in. But there are no signs of life. The plant in the flower pot that Richard Ford singled out in his inscription looks thin and dry, and the weeds growing out from the tiles of this secondary roof look equally desiccated. And there are no children, no toys, no hint of chatter. This combination of different elements and different treatments, sometimes literally unfinished, is typical of Harriet's other drawings of the Alhambra, of which there are, I understand, only 4. This pencil sketch, taken from the ambulatory of the Court of the Lions, combines high levels of architectural detail in the building itself with the sketchiest imaginable treatment of the principal feature. You can just about see in the distance the basin supported by the 12 carved stone lions. That's what everybody has in the center of their drawing, but not Harriet. Like the drawing of the patio of the Meshwar, the angle is oblique, and beyond the surface detail, the tone is elusive. The eminent art historian Peter Hecht tells us that knowledge of contemporary sources, the context in which a work of art was produced, and its later reception are all essential for a better understanding of what you see. But I think that the image itself and the artist who made it should be allowed to speak first. So that's what I've been trying to do in this talk thus far. And when I listen to what I see, to borrow the title of Hecht's most recent book, what I hear is the sound of silence. And that sound is amplified, I think, by what we know of the context of Harriet Ford's work. Firstly, we shouldn't be at all surprised that she was such an accomplished artist, both technically and aesthetically. Drawing will have formed an important part of her education, and she produced a number of prints after Parmigianino, Guido Reni, and Sir Joshua Reynolds while she was still a teenager. She married Richard Ford in 1824 when she was still 17. Their marriage certificate describes her as a minor. He was 28. And she signed some of her prints with her maiden name, Harriet Capel, and some as Harriet Ford, which helps us to date them. Although so little of her work survives, she would certainly have kept her hand in both at home and on her travels. In 1826, 2 years after they were married, Richard took her on the same grand tour that he himself had traveled on 6 years earlier. It's a statement of the obvious, but always worth bearing in mind that in an age before photography, if you wanted a record of where you went and what you saw, you pretty much had to draw it yourself. Drawing was part of everyday life, and it was much better for you than Instagram, because in order to draw, you have to look. Secondly, we shouldn't be surprised at that hint of melancholy that I hear in Harriet's drawings of the Alhambra. It's well known that the Fords went to Spain for her health. What is perhaps less well known is that she had 4 children by the time she was 22. And sadly, the 4th of them, Dudley, died within 9 months. Harriet was heartbroken, and Richard naturally became concerned about her well-being and decided to spend the winter in a warmer climate. They chose Andalusia on the advice of William Mark, the British consul at Malaga. Together with their 3 surviving children and support staff, Richard and Harriet sailed from Plymouth to Gibraltar in October 1830, thence to Cadiz, arriving in Seville by paddle steamer along the Guadalquivir in late November. Now, I don't know about you, but 20 days on the high seas in bad weather with 3 children under 6 doesn't bear thinking about. It's a holiday from hell as far as I'm concerned, particularly since Harriet was carrying their 5th child, Richard Capel, throughout the journey. He was born the following March. Sadly, but perhaps not unexpectedly, neither he nor a 6th child, Concha, born in September 1832, survived until their 1st birthday. So for most of her time in Spain, Harriet will have been literally as well as metaphorically in confinement, carrying, birthing, nursing, grieving, when not actually resting and recovering from the above. So I have no difficulty imagining her on her daybed in that passage leading to the kitchen in the alcaide's quarters, meticulously observing the architecture around her and recording it in her sketchbook with pencil and wash. I have no difficulty imagining the nursemaids tidying away the children while Mama has her rest. And while she rested, Richard was getting restless. In April 1831, a little over 4 months after they arrived in Seville, he set off on the first of his epic journeys of discovery, which were to form the basis of his handbook for travellers in Spain and readers at home. Now, I'm not going to fall into the Odysseus-Penelope trap by implying that Richard went gallivanting off around Spain, leaving his wife to cope on her own. In the last quarter of 1831, she accompanied him on one of the longest trips, this one up the east coast to Barcelona and then back via Madrid. And she also went with him on a brief visit to North Africa in May 1833, not long before they set off on their long overland journey back to England. But in listening to what Harriet, as an artist, is telling me in her drawing of the mâchoire, I also have no difficulty in hearing the sound of loneliness. On their return to England, Richard and Harriet decided to live apart, and she died suddenly in May 1837 at the age of 29. Posterity has not treated Harriet Ford at all badly, it has to be said. Her work has been recognized as accomplished, but there's always been an undertone of condescension. And this tends to surface in the context of her relationship to the work of John Frederick Lewis, where it's frequently assumed that she copied from him. Now, copying the work of others, particularly the great masters, was standard practice in artist training then and now, not least because to copy, you had to look. And as we've seen, Harriet copied Parmigianino and Guido Reni and Joshua Reynolds and made prints after their work. And Lewis himself spent some considerable time in the Prado, making copies of the old masters. The relationship with Lewis is more complicated because Lewis stayed with the Fords as their guest, and it's quite likely that Harriet would have wanted to learn from a young professional artist who was already making his name from his work. Richard wrote in late September 1832 that he was expecting Mr. Lewis from Granada and that he was going to take him into his house. I look forward to his Alhambra drawings, he wrote, and hope my wife will make good copies of them. Maybe she did. But this was late 1832, not the summer of 1831, which is why I think that the date of the mâchoire drawing is so important. Lewis wasn't in Granada in 1831, and when he stayed with them in Granada in 1833, they were not living in that apartment. Antonio Gámez Gordo has drawn attention to two of Lewis's sketches in the V&A that show a close resemblance to details in Harriet's drawings. One is a detail of the mâchoire, but I think it's hard to claim that, chronology apart, Harriet copied her drawing from his. They're very different, and what they have in common is dictated by the architecture. A better comparison, that's just to remind you, of course, there are similarities, but it's the architecture that's creating the similarities. A better comparison would be Lewis's lithograph of the patio as he published it in the 1835 album. Compared to Harriet's oblique view, this is very foursquare, it seems to me. Face on, and to my mind, the costume Bristol figures in the courtyard are stiff and unconvincing. I don't hear any sound at all from this cast of characters. Just out of interest, this is what the patio looks like today. See, the gallery is gone. The windows have been Islamified. The basin there is a copy. It's very, very beautiful. To conclude, I want to return to the window I mentioned earlier. And sorry, there are a couple of, this is the other sketch, the other Lewis sketch in the V&A that Gámez Gordo thinks would have been a model for Harriet's drawing of the Court of the Lions, second drawing of the Court of the Lions. Again, I think it's very, very hard to sustain that the one is derivative of the other. They're completely different in their conception. As I was saying, in order to conclude, I want to return to that window that I mentioned earlier. If you can just see it through the open door on the left-hand side, right at the end there, there's a window. It often occurs to me to wonder what Harriet saw from that window. She didn't, of course, leave any drawings of the view from that room, but Richard did. And I think it's worth finishing with his take on the view, because it helps us to put his approach to drawing and hers into context. At some point, presumably in 1831 again, when they were living in these rooms, he made 5 sketches that together make up a 180-degree panorama from left to right, from the southwest to the northeast of that viewpoint. These sketches are very difficult to show, partly because they were drawn on buff or brown paper that may well have become darker over the past 200 years, and partly due to the constraints of PowerPoint. But I'm going to give it a go and ask you to stitch these panels together in your mind's eye as I show them from left to right. So I want you to imagine looking out of that window at the back of that picture, looking around to your left, and then looking around through 180 degrees. And this is what, if you were Richard Ford, you would have seen. That's the Puerta del Vino, to your left. Then the Plaza de los Aljibes. Then the Sierra Elvira. Oh, we missed one out. I'm going to go back because it's jumped one. Sorry about this. Go back. Right, that's the Puerta del Vino, the Plaza de los Aljibes, the Sierra Elvira, Albaicin, and then the upper part of the Albaicin with the Church of San Nicolas in the center. Now, as you can see, Richard's fast-moving, sketchy technique, he was constantly on the move, sketching very, very quickly. Even when he was standing still looking out of the window, he was still sketching quickly. That's typical of the many drawings that he made on the road. And the contrast with Harriet's way of working couldn't be stronger. But if Richard's sketches provided him with a record of what things looked like, when he got back to England, he took some lessons and worked many of his sketches up into watercolor. And I'd like to end by showing you this panorama, looking back towards the Alhambra from San Nicolas that was in the center of the 5th and last panel that I just showed you. It's not a panorama looking out, it's a panorama looking back. And this is what it looks like today. Isn't that beautiful? Doesn't it make you want to get straight on a plane and see it for yourself? It does me. Thank you very much.
Let me now introduce our second speaker, It's Claudia Hopkins. Claudia Hopkins is professor of art history at Edinburgh College of Art and honorary professor in Hispanic art at Durham University. Has a distinguished career in research and curation. Her expertise lies in 19th and 20th century art and visual culture, focusing on transnational context and issues of identity. Hopkins has curated exhibitions as La España Romántica, David Roberts y Genaro Pérez Villamil, and contributed to significant publications like Hot Art Cold War. Her forthcoming book, Art and Identity in Spain, 1833 to 1956, is highly anticipated. Please. I hand you over. Huh?
Well, thank you very much for the nice introduction. It's a pleasure to be here and to speak to this distinguished audience. There. After this very interesting talk by Sir Barry, I will take you forward in time into the 20th century. It's a picturesque image of Spain, which we saw a little bit in Harriet Ford and George Vivian and David Roberts, mentioned by Sir Barry. This picturesque image was well established by the end of the 19th century. There, and I'm showing you this here as an example because it was presented in an exaggerated or condensed form in this vast theme park, Andalusia, in times of the Moors in Paris in 1900, coinciding with the Universal Exhibition there. It included a replica of Seville Cathedral's bell tower, spaces inspired by the Alhambra, and medieval Toledo. There were flamenco dancers, religious processions, and camel riders. What fun! Spain was a well-established destination for travelers, and many artists continued to come to Spain, but they were now less interested in monuments, less interested in folklore. And as we can see in this example by the Scottish artist Arthur Melville, who arrived in 1890 and again in 1892, he was more concerned with exploring the effects of color and light that Spain had to offer in light with the latest developments in painting after Impressionism. The artists arriving in the 20th century after the Great War were of a more progressive ilk. Gerald Brennell, very well known, a writer associated with the Bloomsbury Group, settled in the remote village of Jaén, high up in the Alpujarra Mountains, the Granada area, which inspired his famous book, South of Granada. Virginia Woolf turned up, and an artist he was in love with, Dora Carrington. And Dora was very inspired, was very taken by the mountains. And this picture is painted from memory back in London, from where she wrote to Brennan that she was very happy working on 2 Jaén pictures. They transport me into another world. I cannot express quite what a relief it is. It's a strange picture, I think. It's clearly inspired by the real thing, but with the soft-shaped mountains in the foreground, the angular forms in the background, we see a little bit of sea in the distance. But this eerie landscape, I think, resonates both with the turmoil of Carrington's personal life and with modernist concerns in art. In fact, Carrington was the only, I think, female member of the so-called Whitechapel Boys, a progressive group of mostly Jewish-born artists from the East End here in London, who studied at the Slade School of Art and are the founders of British modernism. And one of them is David Bomberg, an artist who was profoundly influenced by Spain. He went to Toledo in 1929, then to Ronda and Cuenca in 1934, and then returned to Ronda in 1954, living there. And the photo here on this side dates from that late period, with Bomberg sitting on a donkey and his wife Lillian standing next to him. So Bomberg in Spain, this is really the focus of my talk. The photograph on the left shows him at a younger age, in around 1912, 1914, when he was producing artworks or avant-garde works like this, the mud bars, schematized figures floating across a reddish space, a pool. This is the mud bars. It's inspired by the actual Russian vapor baths in East London, which were used by the local Jewish community to which Bomberg belonged. So Bomberg was really at the forefront of the avant-garde then, but his artistic path was interrupted by the outbreak of the Great War. He enlisted as a soldier. He had a terrible experience, and his approach to painting and his worldview really changed. He became very disillusioned with technological advances that had made the war possible in the first place. So how did he come to Spain? His early interest in Spain came through his admiration of the old master painter El Greco. And this is evident in this sketch here, Zappas at Work, which shows men creating a tunnel towards a base in France where the British Canadian troops managed to inflict a surprise assault on the Germans. The work was a commission from the Canadian War Memorial Fund. So initially, Bomberg was going to create a painting with schematized cubist-influenced figures, as you can see on the left, but he changed his approach to something more representational to appeal to the conservative taste of his patrons. But perhaps also, I think, Bomberg's own nightmare at the war front led him towards a less mechanistic, schematized vision of the soldiers themselves. And I think this is where El Greco comes in. So if you compare these energetic figures with those in El Greco, then you can see that his humanized Zappas are inspired by the contorted figures in El Greco's painting, Purification of the Temple, which he could have seen in the National Gallery. El Greco also continued to be significant to Bomberg's thinking about art in the coming years. In a draft for a lecture he wrote for a lecture he gave on modern art in 1922, I think, he singled out El Greco as a stepping stone towards the making of modern art. So El Greco is here the only old master. He's mentioned alongside the pre-Raphaelites, Whistler, Japanese art, the New English Art Club, the Camden Town Group, Sickert, Cézanne, very important, Impressionism, Post-Impression, and of course Picasso and Matisse and so on. But let's see what he said about El Greco. He referred to this painting in particular and its acquisition by the National Gallery, which had been very controversial. Bomberg said that this painting had the power to annoy people, and he liked it for that. This reaction is perhaps of the people, is perhaps difficult to understand today, but the art critic Roger Fry summed it up perfectly. He said that this acquisition had given the British public an electric shock. And he wrote that people gathered in crowds in front of it. They argue and discuss and lose their temper. And what is more, they talk about it as they might talk about some contemporary picture. Bomberg himself admired the colors in the picture, pink, purple, and especially the interplay of lines and shapes, how everything was arranged, what he called the design or unity of design. And he said that no one but El Greco ever did such a thing as this. El Greco was an inventor. And Bomberg was not alone in his praise of El Greco. Many other, or most modernist artists saw El Greco as a precursor of modern art. Later in life, Bomberg explained that from El Greco, you can learn that drawing and painting is one process. And this is where the truth of life's structure comes in. Making modern art in Britain, where conservative tastes dominated institutions, was, however, very challenging. In 1923, Bomberg compromised somewhat. He accepted a commission from the government-funded Zionist organization to produce topographical paintings of the east of Jerusalem. They're descriptive, realist, yet they do already show his interest in form and structure rather than in recording picturesque cliches, Oriental cliches. He himself regarded these paintings as a failure. But a turning point came in a few years later when seeing a reproduction of one of El Greco's highly imaginative and expressive views of Toledo. Toledo, located high up on a rock, surrounded by the river Tagus. Bomberg reportedly stated, "If Toledo can inspire a painting of that quality, I'm going there." So he went in September 1929, immersing himself in tireless investigations of color, form, and structure for about 6 months. And this experience led him to abandon the realist style of his earlier Eastern landscapes and pursue an intuitive, even physical response to his environment. Here, just for comparison, how far he's moved on from his representational style. Here in the Alcázar and Tajo, the viewpoint is from the top of the Alcázar, it seems, giving us a plunging view over the town and the landscape beyond. The structure or mass of the landscape is conveyed in thick, zigzagging brush strokes all across the surface, making us aware of the artist's intense involvement in the work. And this view is also drawn, this view itself is drawn on the left half of El Greco's view and plan of Toledo, which I showed you earlier, and which Bomberg had described as a kind of imaginative aeroplane view of the city. So in canvas after canvas, Bomberg achieves a new expressive force, which, as Richard Cork, the authority on Bomberg, says, marks the beginning of Bomberg's search for the fundamental rhythms of nature, which he called the expanding mass and later the spirit in the mass. For Bomberg then, Toledo or Spain or the Spanish landscape was a space in which he could both lose and find himself. Bomberg, when living in Toledo, he kept to himself. He said he went out to some bars with some local men. He went to a bullfight. He said he had met a socialist philosopher, but we don't know who. And he said he wasn't interested in the modern Spanish artists. He found them backwards. And he said the best Spanish painters were in Paris, so Picasso and Greece. And he showed no interest in picturing folkloric life. Eventually, Lillian, his partner, came to join him in Toledo for some time. But he was interested in old masters, not just El Greco, but also Velázquez, and especially this painting, which was then in a convent in Toledo. Bomberg, and he knew that the National Gallery was interested in this painting. So Bomberg obtained the permission to export this painting to England on behalf of the National Gallery, but the whole thing came to nothing because, according to Lillian's recollections, and I quote, "The nuns would only let the painting go if we passed the pesetas through the grill in their door as the painting came out. The National Gallery couldn't agree to this informal transaction." So Bomberg and Lillian Holt returned to London without the painting. 4 years later, Bomberg and Holt returned to Spain in the summer of 1934, seeking out new spectacular landscapes. The first stop was Cuenca in between Madrid and Valencia, sort of. Some of his Cuenca, which you can see here, this spectacular location like Toledo, high up on a rock with these famous hanging houses that cling onto this edge. Some of his early paintings are perhaps still quite descriptive, but as the one on the right here, as Richard Cork notes, his style becomes much more experimental when he paints at sunset, and the houses seem to be sort of rooted in the earth or in the rock, and in this particular light, the painting or the view acquires a kind of visionary quality, one might say. The next stop was Ronda. Of course, many writers and artists had been inspired and felt overwhelmed by Ronda in the south, another spectacularly located town high up on a rock plateau, divided by a gorge and connected by a monumental bridge. The early 19th century Scottish artist David Roberts was awed by this town, and he thought it was best painted from a distance where you can take it all in. Modernists too were fascinated. Famously, the German poet Rainer Maria Rilke stated that the spectacle of this city is indescribable. And it was in Ronda that Rilke, a very troubled poet, overcame a massive writing block and produced some of his best poetry, and where he also achieved some of sense of harmony between himself and the world he was in. In simpler terms, Dora Carrington wrote from Ronda to a friend that Ronda was the most enchanting city she had ever seen, and that she could live there and paint and grow old. To return to Bomberg, he did not approach Ronda as Roberts did from a distance. His goal was something closer to what Rilke was trying to achieve, kind of unity between a sense of self and the world, what he described the mass. He mostly worked in charcoal, producing very ambitious pieces. Their works, they're not sketches for paintings, they're works in their own right, done on very good quality handmade paper. On the left, you see one from the beginning of his day, fairly descriptive or literal, but in the other ones here, you can see that he transmits a more personal view, transmitting his own experience of the town and its locations, rock. He progressed in similar ways in his paintings, painted in thick and dynamic, sometimes violent brushstrokes in vivid colors that convey the heat, light, and shade. And here we are looking right into the gorge from below, and between the rocks, which, as Rilke said in his description, seem to be rent asunder by a pickaxe. We get some sense of this violence here in this painting on the right. And just to show you, and here some other paintings, very different. There's Ronda seen from a distance at sunset, very intense. And this is one of the very few where he actually focuses on figures. This is a procession, an Easter procession, seen from a balcony looking into the street, but you can see it's almost abstracted. So this was an exciting time artistically, but also personally, because it was in Ronda where his daughter was born. And you can see him there, and in the middle with his young baby daughter and his stepdaughter, Dinara, and here himself and Lillian on their apparently much loved donkeys. But the time in Ronda came to an end in 1935. With the political turmoil. And on their way back, they stopped in Asturias, where Bomberg naturally was attracted to the Picos de Europa. And he stayed there, or they stayed there for a few months on a farm near or in Linares, where he painted this plunging view from into the valley and many other amazing paintings. After his return to London, some of his paintings were exhibited, but generally they were not commercially successful, and he was really shunned by the official art world. When you read about Bomberg, you realize how prejudiced the art world is, and it's not fair. So Bomberg felt frustrated. These were difficult years. There was the Spanish Civil War, World War II, the Cold War breaking out, difficult years in every sense. To make a living, he took up teaching in 1946 at Borough Polytechnic. Apparently he had applied had sent out 300 job applications, and he was finally given this, which is now South Bank University. Considering that the official art world rejected him, it is ironic, though, that Bomberg had a massive influence on his students who later became major figures in the British art world, and that is Leon Kossoff and Frank Auerbach. They came to see Bomberg because he was an exciting teacher, and they wanted to escape from the more conservative teaching that happened at St. Martin's or the Royal College. So Bomberg was seen as a sort of dangerous, influential teacher. Anyway, as a teacher, he often cited the 18th century philosopher Bishop Berkeley, saying pure visual perception was a delusion. One also had to think about tactility when perceiving things. He also said that art is conceived as a density of cosmic forces compressed into a small space. He encouraged students to follow the path that he had discovered in Spain. And he wanted to arrive at a more enhanced understanding of the structure of things, the mass as understood as a living, animate thing, what he would call the spirit in the mass. So after much frustration with London, he and his family decided to leave and return to Ronda in 1954, and they settled there. So this was just after Franco Spain was opening up to the West, and by 1955, Spain was admitted to the United Nations. This is really when real tourism starts in Spain. Bomberg arrived with ambitions for establishing an international art school in Ronda. They rented a villa, printed an advertisement, which stated that their aim was to, and I quote, free the practice of art from the limitations of academic painting since the 17th century. And students would be encouraged to comprehend and interpret their individual assessment of mass in the representation of form, whether in landscape, architecture, or working from life in the various aspects of drawing and painting. And the classes were going to be in English and Spanish, which is intriguing because he didn't really speak Spanish. But the plans came to nothing due to the fallout with the owner of the building. But some other students came from London, and there was a sense of community there where he and Lillian painted similar pictures, and also the people who came to see him there. And Bomberg carried on with his charcoal drawings. Rhonda sometimes appears gloomy, tragic, sometimes lighter. And this is the last work he painted, where really everything dissolves, where the setting seems to become, or the rock, or the town becomes one with the earth and the sky, and the brush strokes seem to be more fluid, colors bleeding into each other. Bomberg fell very ill and at that time, and he died shortly after his return to London. So what do we make of this episode, Bomberg? Bomberg in the history of artist travelers to Spain. His work is atypical in that he never engaged with the myth of old romantic Spain, but instead he came closer to nature by completely immersing himself in the landscape, which somehow resonated with his own mind and being. And in this process, he painted what some of us think are the most exciting landscapes of Spain. Thank you.
Last but not least, okay. Our third speaker is Tom Cheshire. Tom Cheshire is an accomplished travel writer, authoring 11 captivating travel books that have whisked him from Hull to Tripoli, with adventures spanning North Korea, Nepal, India, and beyond. His work has graced the pages of esteemed publications such as The Times, The Guardian, and the Financial Times, while his magazine contributions include National Geographic Traveler and Condé Nast Traveler. In his latest book, Lost in the Lakes, Notes from 379-mile walk around the Lake District, Cheshire embarks on a unique journey around the Lake District, exploring its lesser-known corners. Prior works, like Park Life and Slow Trains Around Spain, showcase his knack for immersive storytelling. Please, Tom.
Thank you all very much for coming, and thank you for inviting me at the Institute. I don't have a slideshow, so I'm just going to rely on a few words. But now, the title of my particular part of this will be A Travel Reporter's Ramble Around 21st Century Spain. Now, maybe the word ramble in this instance, because I wrote a book about my journey called Slow Trains Around Spain, is incorrect. It's more like a rattle around Spain on the little train tracks around the country. And what I did was travel 3,000 miles on 52 rides around Spain. And what I was trying to do is learn a bit about, I suppose, 21st century Spain. I had no other choice. There's no other century I was in. And perhaps I will try and explain here my role as a travel reporter. So first of all, you know who on earth I am. So a little bit about myself. I worked as a travel reporter now for 30 years, and I've written 11 travel books, or my 12th is on the way. And I started off as a sports writer, and I worked very early on for the Times for 20 years. And I had great pleasure to be sent all around the world to places like North Korea, Iran, America, Peru, China, all sorts of spots. I've been very blessed to have such a lucky job. And since leaving the Times a few years ago, I've been on and off working freelance for the Daily Mail, the Mail on Sunday, the Guardian, the Sun. I've previously worked for the News of the World. I've worked for the Express, the Sunday Express. I've worked for the New European newspaper. I've worked for Geographical, the Critic, basically anyone who will pay me. And so that's the story of a travel journalist, to give a little bit of background. And so I've also written 12 travel books, and one of those was
slow trains around Spain, and I took the journey in 2019. Now, why, you may ask, why did I want to go around Spain? Well, I'll give a little bit of background to that. Well, now there's a lot that goes on a lot of Spain goes into the travel sections in the newspapers of Britain and into the magazines. And what most people know about Spain, I suppose, will come from those maybe sometimes cliched perceptions that are given in presented in the newspapers. And that's the common knowledge for a lot of people of Spain. And what do you get to find out in the newspapers? Well, there's a lot about the Costas, there's a lot about the Balearics, there's a lot about the Canaries, there's a lot about the big cities of Madrid, Barcelona, Valencia in particular. And the kind of, I mean, I was just glancing online yesterday to have a look at what was knocking around, and you have Spain's 20 greatest seaside towns, the 10 best places to stay in the Balearics, the 10 most stylish hotels on Ibiza, the 20 must-see sites in the Canaries, or how to spend a charming weekend in Barcelona. This is the type of article that very often goes in. Or you may have Madrid on a budget, Barcelona on a budget, Valencia on a budget. The sultry pleasures of Seville. Seville is always sultry in the headlines, or very, very often sultry. And you may notice that there are a lot of lists that go into these newspapers. So the travel sections and magazines, endless 10 best of this, 20 best of that, practical, useful information, rather than maybe the sideways views of Spain that you might not get into these travel sections, the incidental stories that maybe some of the older writers or the writers from before we had Gerald Brennan then, and people like Laurie Lee, the kind of stuff that doesn't really matter, but actually does matter, doesn't really get into the travel sections, but you get an awful lot of very good practical advice about the places that you maybe everyone knows a lot about already. And of course, there are exceptions. One of my favorite travel writers at the moment, journalist, is Annie Bennett, who has a great experience of Spain and writes all sorts of great stuff. Yet, Spain is Britain's #1 tourist destination, as Manuel Butler well knows. And we talked about 17 million Brits going. Well, sometimes it's 18 million, sometimes it's a lot. And it's the #1. It took over from France, so well done, Manuel Butler, some time ago. And it's a very big, country. So within the European Union, only France is bigger. And I did a bit of hard research here, and I Googled the size of Spain, and it's 505,990 square kilometers. Well, that's more than double the size of UK. UK is 244,820 square kilometers. So it's double the size of Britain, of the UK. Only France is bigger at 547,000 square kilometers. So we've got this huge country that we love to go to, and it's written about the whole time, but only certain parts are written about it. And so the perception of Spain that I was getting as a seasoned, I suppose, travel writer was of, here's this popular place, but why do we know so little about it? When you look at the map of Spain, we saw it earlier, was it the Richard Ford route, which was scarily close to what I did 190 years later. But what goes on in these bits in the middle between the cities? Now, there was one way to find out, which was to go and have a look. Well, fortunately, there are a lot of trains in Spain. And now, of course, when the Expo 1992 happened, the fast trains began in Spain. And then now Spain has this brilliant radial system of trains that zoom off in all sorts of in the directions and spiking off like star shapes. But I didn't want to go on these trains. I'd been on them. I'd written a piece for the Times about it, and I enjoyed going from Barcelona to Zaragoza. But felt like I was floating in a parallel universe. As lovely as it was to float in this parallel universe, I wasn't learning much about the country, all these bits on the map that you couldn't I didn't know about. So I decided to go along the small regional trains of Spain, and to take the I downloaded the Renfe app, and I became an expert on the Renfe app, and you could actually get cheaper tickets on the Renfe app than that's a traveler's tip for you, than at the stations. So often you could be at the station, stare at the board, 35 euros, that's expensive. And then you go on the app and it would be 16 euros. And you think, well, that's a bargain. But anyway, so I used the trains to explore the bits that weren't being reported in this big country that was that we all loved. And I found it weird that it wasn't looked at as much as often as focused in on these other parts. So off I went, and I'll give you a very, and I decided to let the random rule. I decided just to let the incidental bits, the bits that we don't think are important, possibly become the important parts of the book. And I'll just give you a little rundown of the journey. That map would have actually been helpful, but I kind of can almost do it off by heart. So I began in Figueres. I went to Blanes. I went to ignoring Barcelona because it was written about so often. I went to Vilanova y la Geltrú. I went to Montserrat, Manresa, Zaragoza, Pamplona, San Sebastian, Bilbao, Santander, Oviedo, Ferrol, Santiago de Compostela, Zamora, Madrid, Segovia, Madrid, Badajoz, Merida, Almaden, Ciudad Real, Aranjuez, Cuenca, that we just saw the pictures of, Valencia, Alcoy, Alicante, Benidorm, Aguias, Almeria, Granada, Algeciras, Ronda, Seville. So that was the route. And I loved Ronda so much that I recently went back there on a personal holiday, but it was very free. It was cold in February in Ronda, and it didn't look as sunny as those paintings in those paintings. But that was the route. And of course, I've touched on many of the autonomous communities and went to a lot of different places in between. So I was trying to flesh out, and as a kind of 21st century travel journalist, see the bits that were not being written about so much, and be a rather nosy reporter all the way along. Now, along the way, to kind of flesh out the details of the book and my experience, I talked to lots and lots of people. So I'll give a small rundown of the people I talked to, and then I'll come to my impressions of 21st century Spain as a nosy travel reporter. But so I started, I would talk to the railway staff, I talked to the hotel owners, the cafe owners, the barmen, barwomen, the bull runners, the asylum campaigners, asylum seeker campaigners, the nuns, the pilgrims, the fellow tourists, the tourist officials, people promoting tourism and travelers, the guides, the backpackers, dropouts who didn't seem to have anywhere to go, mechanics, teachers, engineers, university professors, taxi drivers, bankers, bookshop owners, cargo train campaigners, flamenco dancers, musicians, all sorts of people. So the idea was to not using a brush, but to try and paint a picture of Spain that didn't get into the travel sections by going on this route and being a nosy travel reporter, using, I suppose, the only skills I had, which was to be nosy and to be a reporter. So I will come, what I wanted to go to explain, I suppose, in a very simple manner and within my 20-minute slot, was that obviously I came to, I suppose, two conclusions which really sprung out at me. And one coming from Britain, where we're in a much smaller space, which is a much higher density of population. In fact, I did look into this. The density of population in Britain is 279 people per square kilometer, whereas in Spain, it's 94. So it's 3 times more crowded in Britain than it is in Spain. And of course, that naturally has an effect on what the country is like. And the thing that really sprung out of me as I was going around on the trains and dropping off in different places, and even in the big cities, was the strong sense of community. And this was to do with the chatter in the small squares and the people going for walks after siestas and the time that people seem to have over a coffee in the morning or a glass of wine in the evening, and with the dogs at their feet and the children kicking the ball against the wall. And this felt so different immediately. And I had taken the train down from St. Pancras, ended up in Figueres, and immediately I was in a completely different culture to Britain. And this sense of community was almost shocking, given how things have become in Britain, with town centres being overtaken by large chains and people shopping online, and without the weather to allow 10 p.m. kind of chats in the square. And so this really came across as one simple observation of a traveller in 21st century Spain that doesn't necessarily come across in the articles in the newspapers about where is the best place to get tapas in Barcelona or the newest chic hotel in Ibiza town. The second was, now coming back to the kind of theme of travelers in 21st century Spain, was the importance of tourism. And you just cannot get away from that when you think about Spain these days, as Manuel knows with the figures with GDP. So the GDP of Spain is 11.6% tourism, 1.9 million jobs, 9.3% of employment. So it's massively important. And those are just the figures that we have as the basic figures. Of course, there's lots of trickle down and other effects of the importance of tourism. Now, this was evident every single place I went, more or less, even in Almaden, a tiny little town in the middle of Spain that's best known for its old mercury mine. They even had a tourist tour, a tour of the old mercury mine. But I'll just go through a few of the examples of the huge power and importance of tourism in each place. I mean, in Figueres, of course, you had Salvador Dali and the Dali connection. Well, you had a shop selling Dali socks, T-shirts, tea towels, laptop covers, necklaces, stress relief balls, perfumes, salt and pepper shakers, anything that could possibly be sold more or less with Dali on it. In Montserrat, not so far away, well, the monks weren't going to, miss their chance. And with the Black Madonna, so many different things in their gift shop, tea towels, of course, bandanas, shawls, thermometers, egg timers, snow globes, Christmas tree decorations, back scratchers come shoehorns, everything for sale with the Black Madonna or image of Montserrat on it. This was up in the hills, the tourism, shot glasses even, espresso cups. And then onwards to Zaragoza, you had the Cathedral Basilica of Our Lady of the Pillar and the Goya connection, and many forms of tourism connected to those. In Pamplona, you had the bulls. In Bilbao, you had the Guggenheim. In Santiago de Compostela, you had the pilgrims and the gift shop selling some images of scallops and a huge tourism industry going on in, let's see, where we got to Merida. You had the Romans. In Ciudad Real. Well, you even had the Cervantes Museum, which I wasn't that much of a fan of in Ciudad Real, and using Don Quixote, and you had the windmills that you could go and have a look at. Cuenca, you had the artists. Valencia, you had the city of the arts and the sciences, and also the beach. In Benidorm, well, you had lots and lots of different things in Benidorm. which are not very cultural. And then in Granada, you had Alhambra. In Malaga, the Picasso Museum. Ronda, the Gorge and the Bull Ring. Seville, you had many, for the flamenco, the tapas, the castles, the cathedrals, so many things in Seville, which was probably my favorite of all the main cities. Everywhere you went, though, tourism was the theme. So it wasn't just in the Costas and the Balearics and the Canary Islands. Everywhere, the monks were in on the business. Nobody was missing their chance. So what I wanted to highlight, I suppose, as a very, very simple point, as a 21st century traveler in Spain, is that now, if you think about culture in Spain, tourism is there, whether you like it or not. And of course, over-tourism gets so criticized, and rightly so. It's a big problem in Barcelona in particular. However, tourism, in my eyes, and from being a reporter and not having an agenda, wanting to see things, is part of the culture now of Spain. So now, if you look at how 21st century Spain is different from 20th century Spain, well, maybe 20th century Spain was trying to get used to the idea of all these people coming in. Well, now the horse has bolted. Tourism is a big part of Spanish life and a big part of culture in Spain. So so you cannot take the two apart. You can't take the two apart. So what I would like to do, my favorite book about Spain is by Norman Lewis, and it's called Voices of the Old Sea. And it's a very last moment, won't be long, but it's a quote about when tourism first came to the Costa Brava, and he noticed the first tourists arriving in Spain, and he mentioned that the first guests at the hotel arrived in some style in a chauffeur-driven Isotta Fraschini car at the end of May, providing instant and final confirmation of the villagers' belief that all outsiders were basically irrational. And when they were not irrational, maybe they were all actually mad. And that was his impression all that time on. So from that point of Norman Lewis first observing tourists in the post-war period, 1950s, to now, tourism has just ballooned to such an extent that obviously it's 18 million and an important part of the economy, with 12% of the economy. However, it is still a beguiling country, and one of the greatest ways to see it, as I found myself, is by train, slow trains. And so when thinking of those pictures back there and seeing the early travelers to Spain and how they took sketches and how they painted so beautifully, and you think now of people with their cameras taking shots with Instagram and how dull that is. Well, there's an adventure still to be had if you go and download the Renfe app and take the little trains, the slow trains around Spain. That's it.
Thank you very much. We have just some minutes, maybe one question for each, because we are running out of time. So is there any question on the floor? Please raise your hand, please.
Yeah, no, the last slide, Laura, Claudia, that you showed, it almost reminded me of the recent Cézanne exhibition of Mount Saint-Victoire. And it made me wonder whether that had an influence on Bloomberg.
Yes, I think so. He talked about Cézanne. Cézanne was very important to him, and especially that particular painting. So I think that could have well been on his mind. So I think when he approached the landscape was Cézanne, it's all about form and structure, but then the imagination from El Greco. So
Tom, mine's a very cheeky question. You very cleverly gave us the list of all the sort of cliche stuff in the travel sections. But when you listed towards the end of your talk the places you've been to, every one of them was on that list. And so my question is, did you at any stage get off at places like Fatra, Madrigal de los Altas Torres, Medina del Campo? In other words, places with 2,000 population, rather than all the very well-known places.
Well, Al Madden, I certainly did. That's Al Madden in the centre where the mercury mines were. But but also, if you think about it, you don't get that many articles actually about Benidorm, and it doesn't. So, funnily enough,
We need any.
well, it's an unreported area. So for me, it was quite interesting to go and see some of these places and to see not be led by the tourist cliches, but to see what's around the edges, see it with a fresh eye.
Yeah, thank you.
So let me just, the last question for you, Sir Barry. If we want to go to our library here, what book you will recommend to start with? If you want to learn about these first travelers to Spain, what do you recommend? To start with Ford, of course, but besides that?
I would,
The Romantic Spain.
Claudia's heard me say this before, and I'll say it again. Romantic Spain is one of my desert island books. It's phenomenally learned, well-researched, beautifully illustrated, beautifully written, and you can just curl up with that, and you can learn all about David Roberts and Villamil, and the context of in which those two artists work. There would be on every reading list I could possibly imagine.
I agree.
Thank
We
you.
took that book as our guide.
We should say it is multiple award winning.
Oh.
Two.
Okay, so we are running out of time. We have also Alberto's the book in our library. All of the book, of course, Claudia's book is in our library. So please, this is everything we do today is because we want to promote our library. This is a jewel we have. We have 4,000 books here and in this library. So please join this library. 40,000, sorry. Yes. Yes. Okay, so thank you very much for coming. Thank you especially for your speakers, and see you next July the 2nd. We have the Juan Sebastián Elcano in a bigger venue. We have 250 seats that time. So I'm sorry but we wanted to start here because of the library. Thank you very much.